I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 65 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23rd, 2022. A reminder to all is that please address your comments through the chair. Screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on January 18, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the ecosystem impacts and the management of pinniped populations. I would like to welcome our first panel of witnesses, Carl Walters, Professor Emeritus, Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, University of British Columbia, by video conference. Representing the Institute of Marine Research, we have Tor Hogg, I hope I pronounced that right, Scientist Emeritus, by video conference. And representing the Maritime Seal Management Incorporated, we have Daniel Lane, Professor, by video conference as well. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. We'll go to Dr. Walters first, please, for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? So I've been studying salmon populations, dynamics, and ecosystem changes in the Pacific Coast for about 50 years. A few years ago, I was approached by the Pacific Balance Pinniped Society, people you had as witnesses, and asked to write a proposal for commercial seal harvesting on the West Coast, with the primary purpose being to reduce seal abundance and increase salmon populations. I'd like to just make a few general points, and you can raise other things in question and answers. First point is that there are probably at least twice as many seals and stellar sea lions on the BC coast today than there have been for the last several thousand years, because First Nations people harvested them intensively before white men arrived on the coast and kept the numbers down quite a bit. Sea lions in particular now consume more fish than all the commercial fisheries combined. They mostly hake and herring, but also salmon. They eat over 300,000 tons of fish per year. Seals and sea lion increases since 1970 have been correlated with increasing mortality rates, particularly of Chinook and coho salmon on the BC south coast, and with herring populations on the outside north coast. We're not talking about a new problem associated with recent climate change. The Georgia Strait Chinook and coho fishery, one of our most valuable fisheries in BC, started to collapse during the 1980s. And that collapse was not stopped or reversed by harvest rate restrictions imposed by John Fraser when he was Minister of Fisheries, or by even more severe harvest restrictions that David Anderson imposed during the 1990s when he demanded to put conservation first and made major salmon commercial fishery closures along the coast. The Pacific Balance Pinniped Society proposal was based largely on the idea of reducing the pinniped populations by about 50% to the level where they're most productive to sustain harvest. And that would result, we calculated, in a sustainable harvest that would result in an income of at least $1.5 million a year to the people who do the harvesting. That proposal was banged around in DFO and over the last several years, with their main excuse for not proceeding being a lack of demonstration that the fishery would be economically viable, but they won't allow any harvesting to try to sell the animals to see how to develop markets for them. DFO has consistently ignored seal and sea lion impacts in its policy planning and has failed to even approve test commercial harvests, like I said. First Nations people can now get permits to kill seals, but only for food and ceremonial purposes. Just removing that food and ceremonial restriction on sale from their permits would lead to the needed harvesting and marketing tests. Pinniped reduction is not certain to result in salmon stock increases because of issues like whether the salmon killed by the seals and sea lion are largely ones that would have died anyway due to diseases and other factors. So the seal reduction policy and harvest development policy is what we call an adaptive management experiment. It has reasonably good odds of success. Andrew Trites told you the odds are only 30%. I don't know where he got that number. There's no science to back that up. My personal assessment would be that the odds of a successful outcome from the salmon side is at least 50%. So that concludes my opening comments.
Thank you. We'll now go to Dr. Hogg for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. It is a main principle in Norwegian management of seals and whales that no stock can be hunted without updated information about abundance. The walrus has been protected in our area since 1952, while ringed seals, bearded seals, harbor seals, and grey seals are hunted in a very small game hunt. Norwegian commercial sealing has always been based on harp seals in the Greenland Sea and southeastern Barents Sea, and hooded seals in the Greenland Sea. But results from the most recent PUP survey in 2022 suggest that current Greenland Sea hooded seals PUP production remains at a very low level, which is now less than 10% of the level in 1946. And following the implemented precautionary harvest strategy, the advice suggests that no harvest be allowed. And this stock has been protected since 2007. The 2022 PUP production estimate for Greenland Sea harp seals is similar to previous surveys estimates from 1991 to 2018, and the stock is probably counts some 500,000-600,000 animals and is still harvested commercially at a very low scale. Numbers taken in 2022 were only 1,400 animals. Recent Russian aerial surveys of the White Sea, Barents Sea harp seals stocks suggest that there may have been a sudden reduction in PUP production after 2003. Nevertheless, the stock still counts around 1.5 million animals, and there is a current small Norwegian hunt, but the Russians haven't hunted in this area since 2008. It is well known that the population dynamics of harp seals have been influenced by commercial hunts, which resulted in significant declines after World War II. However, lower catcher and improved management have lessened the influence of hunting, and today the removals in the West Ice and East Ice areas where we hunt are way below the scientific advice for sustainable harvest. In a recent study of prey consumption by the marine mammal community in our areas, that means both seals and whales, we assessed that the marine mammals removed an annual amount of 25 million tons of prey per year. And for comparison, the removals by fisheries is only a little over 4 million tons per year from the same areas. Along with cod and minke whites, harp seals are the main top predators in the Barents Sea ecosystem. In the decade leading up to 2015, the abundance of cod increased to record high levels. In spite of this, the growth of condition of individual cods has remained rather stable. The body condition, which is used the blubber thickness of harp seals and minke whites, has, however, decreased. And a possible hypothesis for explaining this is that cod, in fact, outperform marine mammal stocks in the competition for food in our area. Finally, climate change is a challenge for several pinniped populations. With the assumed and observed reductions in ice cover, pagophilic seal species such as harp and hooded seals will experience marked breeding habitat loss in traditional breeding areas and will certainly undergo distributional changes, presumably also abundance reductions with subsequent consequences for traditional harvest. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hogg. We'll now go to Dr. Lane for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am in Cape Breton, Petit de Gras to be exact, and I acknowledge this as Unimaki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Mr. Chair, committee members, I pose 3 questions related to your mandate. Do seals impacts imply that inaction is complicit in DFO documented inability to violate their conservation and biodiversity mandates? Secondly, is there market potential for seal products despite closed markets in some cases? And thirdly, why does Canada not support active management? Mr. Perkins, committee member, acknowledged the 2012 DFO recommendation to remove 73,000 gray seals from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Committee members are also aware that there has been no such action on these seals. Marine science is notoriously uncertain, as Dr. Walters noted. Yet 15 years ago, DFO scientists declared the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence Atlantic cod stock certain to be extirpated within 40 years with no fishery. In 2019, the latest stock assessment, they declared this cod population is expected to continue to decline toward extinction. DFO scientists' descriptions of seals' impacts that lead for certain to extirpation and extinction is shocking and disturbing. And so I ask again, does inaction violate the Fisheries Act of Canada and our international commitments to the Convention on Biodiversity? Can this committee effectively communicate Canadian legal obligations to the cabinet table so that we can act? The committee has heard resounding evidence that markets are clearly not a deterrent to action. Socioeconomic benefits and human health products obliges Canada to develop an industry and supply markets for worldwide consumption. You heard about the online education and outreach of the impressive work of the SEALs and Sealing Network. Dion Dakins, a previous witness, commented on the global demand for omega-3 seal oil. I also mentioned the ongoing work of Perennia in Nova Scotia around analysis of seals' meat for the valuable raw food for pets market and their interest in acquiring available capacity to do this work in Nova Scotia. Engaging Export Development Canada and extending CMAPs to support nationwide sealing and worldwide market access is required. Dr. Walters, I'm happy he's here with us today, said this in response to West Coast impacts and science uncertainties at the December Senate committee meetings related to seals. He said, maybe the question you need to ask is how to proceed. What is the best recommendation you can make concerning the development of marine mammal harvesting systems, given the information you now have, in terms of the potential value of those marine mammal harvests as fisheries in their own right, and also the benefits that they may have for some fish stocks? Important evidence of your committee meeting spoke of action planning and action teams. I acknowledge my MP, Mr. Kellaway's points in this regard, as well as Mme. Debien's comment to Gilles Thériault to develop seal product marketing in the Maggies. All good. Action on seals must be industry focused and supported nationally, not just by DFO, as the FRCC had recommended since 1998. This has to be done in a manner that is ecologically sustainable, economically viable, socially stable, and administratively efficient. We know how to do this. Nova Scotia's highly successful lobster sector, Canada's most valuable commercial fishery, provides the model template: local harvesting operations, centralized exporters maintaining secure markets, and a global customer base that trust our exporters to provide timely, valued, certified, and quality products. Seals also provide an opportunity to redefine how Canada manages in the marine ecosystem. We need a new DFO, not a paternal regulator managing pirates, but an auditor that sets basic rules and oversees the industry to meeting and reporting on stated objectives and incentivizes industry to plan for sustainability and to operate strategically. A local seal company should be required to compete with and conform to bids for a formal request for proposal that include requirements to achieve pre-specified objectives. Past committees have recommended all the characteristics of a seal's business action plan: sustainable harvest over a strategic planning period, defined ethical harvesting and processing methods, including additional support to build new harvesting capacity. We need trained professional seal harvesters and partners from indigenous communities. Harvesters deputized as scientist observers of the marine ecosystem, and full disclosure of operations through regular consultations with the local community as shareholders and with the NGOs, of course, as transparency toward ecosystem sustainability, socioeconomic viability, and management efficiency. We have an opportunity to take action that embraces local, sustainable, value-added consequences. I fear it is now too late for Atlantic cod, but if we continue to do nothing, then we should consider ourselves to be all complicit. Thank you for your attention and good luck with your report writing.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. We'll now go to our first round of questioning. We'll start off with Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start off with Mr. Walters, and thank all the witnesses for being here, but I'll start off with Mr. Walters. Mr. Walters, we've heard that through some top scientific studies have provided conclusive evidence that 30 to 50% of outbound Chinook, coho, and steelhead smolts are consumed in the Salish Sea upon their arrival in the migration up the Gulf. If the pinnipeds were reduced, pinniped populations reduced, in your opinion, what would the impact be on smolt predation levels, and would it be reduced proportionately?
Yeah, we calculate that about half the predation rates would be reduced by about 50% if the seal numbers were reduced by 50% in the Georgia Strait. That wouldn't allow a complete recovery of the fishery to its 1970 levels, but it would build up enough to attract a substantial increase in sport fishing effort, which would have substantial economic benefits to small communities around the Georgia Strait. So, no, we're not, the proposal is not to fully rebuild the salmon stocks.
Okay. Are there other species that would also benefit from this a management regime?
If the harvest regime includes stellar sea lions, which are currently protected, we think it would have a substantial benefit to the herring fishery, particularly on the west coast of Vancouver Island and up in Haida Gwaii. The fisheries in those areas for herring have been closed for almost 20 years now because of very low survival rates, very high natural mortality rates in the herring that we calculate are largely due to the stellar sea lion. So those fisheries would be at least partially restored and made more resilient. Stellar sea lions can exert what's called depensatory mortality. It doesn't, when they eat a certain amount of herring, it doesn't mean anything if the herring is a bit population is large, it's a small percentage of the population that's being eaten. But when a herring stock gets reduced, when they have poor recruitment or something, then that same stellar sea lion consumption has a much bigger impact on them. So the stellar sea lion is a continued threat to drive herring populations down to low levels for long periods of time.
Thank you. Can you tell us, are all of the pinniped species on BC's west coast native or indigenous to the area, or have some of them moved into BC's west coast from other areas?
No, they're indigenous. They're found in the middens of First Nations people up and down the coast, going back as far as middens can be examined.
All species of pinnipeds?
When First Nations people first invaded BC in the end of the Pleistocene, they did so not as fishing people, but as hunting people, and they never lost those hunting traditions.
Okay, thank you. We're going to hear from officials kind of to wrap up this study, and we're probably going to hear that they're working to ensure seal populations remain above a precautionary population level, not that they would, and not that they operate in a management system to reduce populations of any species. Should that management regime change from managing only for to keep species above a minimum level? Should it also take into consideration a maximum healthy ecosystem level?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, like other mammal populations, they produce the largest annual surplus that can be harvested on a sustained basis when they're reduced to something around half of the level that they achieve when they're not harvested. So if we calculate that if the seal population were reduced by about 50% and then kept near that level, it would produce the largest annual surplus. The pup survival rates would improve considerably. As the seal population built up on the BC coast, the survival rates of their pups through their first year of life dropped from about 80% down to around 30%. And starving seal pups wash up on shore and so on. So it's not what you'd call a healthy situation from the standpoint of the seal population to be as large as it is.
I'll quickly switch to Mr. Hogg if I could. Mr. Hogg, I'm looking at a chart of cod stocks in Norway and how they've recovered after a seal invasion, and it appears that something happened to that seal population where the cod stocks have now rebounded to their highest levels ever. Can you elaborate on what's taken place there to allow those cod stocks to recover?
No, it's a good question. We have seen that the cod stock increased tremendously after year 2000 up to 2015. Now it is reducing again. And of course, the answer for why this happens is much more complicated than relating it just to seals. It also has to do with good and bad year classes of the cod. But what we have seen primarily in our areas is that has been a severe reduction in seal hunting, both for harp seals and in both in the west ice and in the east ice. So one should expect that these populations has grown. We haven't seen very clear signs of that. We have in fact seen some reduction in pup production, especially in the white sea population, and we don't see very much harp seals feeding on cod, but we think that there is some sort of competition between cod and seals, and also with whales. But in the Barents Sea area, it is cod, harp seals, and minke whales that are the prime top predators. And but I think they are more competitors than predators on each other.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're going a little bit over, but we didn't want to interrupt the answer. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for attending our session today. We'll go back with you, Mr. Hogue. Norway harvests both seals and whales, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Has that in any way damaged trade relationships with the United States in fish products or any other products?
Not as far as I know, because we have, I mean, we can't export any products or from seals or whales to the US, but as far as I know, it hasn't affected our export of other seafood products to that country.
To Dr. Walters, do you think climate change may solve the problem for us? We've already heard that sea ice conditions, particularly on the East Coast, are deteriorating, which of course has an impact on the seal population's ability to procreate. Is this something that, if we're considering reducing the size of the herd, should we also allow for the impact of climate change?
It looks like the climate changes that are going on are actually favoring some of the main prey of the seals and sea lions on our coast. They haul out on rocks, so the ice isn't an issue for them. But the hake population, one of their main foods, is doing very well. Herring, some of the herring, part of the herring decline, and certainly part of the salmon decline that we've seen, does appear to be related to climate change factors, particularly extreme temperature conditions and things like that. But that's the kind of thing that management can deal with by monitoring population size, monitoring productivity, and adjusting the harvest from year to year. This is standard practice in fisheries. It's called feedback control or harvest control
All right, thank you.
measure procedures.
To Dr. Lane, the focus in our discussions and our questions is focused on salmon on the West Coast and cod on the East Coast. Do you think we're missing something, though, by focusing on those two main species and not really, getting a better picture of the total impact on all species, some of which, of course, complement the presence of cod in the East and salmon in the West? Do you think that we really need to take an all-species approach to assessing what's going on with pinniped populations? I think you might be on mute, sir.
Yes, sorry about that. Thank you for the question. I have no doubt that there are bigger questions with respect to impacts of seals on the ecosystem as a whole. But quite frankly, sir, we will never get to know that. And the idea that we should spend our efforts in trying to understand what those impacts are, I'm not sure what kind of answer that we're looking for. You as a committee or committees over the last 40 years? What do you need to know that will tell you and tell your clients, and I'm thinking about the cabinet table, I guess, enough to say that we should move and do something? I mean, there's no doubt that those impacts are there. It's pretty clear, even on from the aggregate level, from the individual level. It's all there. We need to proceed, as Dr. Walters would say.
Thank you for that. We have heard testimony that the health of the pinniped population on the East Coast particularly is declining. And I'm just wondering if, we left alone, we're going to get to kind of a Darwinian kind of result where all species, all stocks are going to be just basically clinging to survival if something doesn't happen. Dr. Walters, can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, like I said, as these pinniped populations have built up in BC, we've seen the standard mammalian density dependence in the survival rates of juvenile animals. They drop down and so on. We're also seeing a recent decline in the abundance of harbor seals, most likely associated with the continued growth in the transient killer whale population. Mother transient killer whales train their juveniles to hunt for mammals by taking them hunting for seal pups in close to the shoreline. Other times they feed further offshore. So yeah, we'll see these continued changes going on. What you said before, we can monitor them and we can respond to them. We've tried to develop computer simulation models that look at the whole ecosystem and all of the possible interactions among multiple, up to 60 different species of creatures at once in these models. And the models do whatever you'd like them to do. There are just too many uncertainties that we will never be able to resolve by going out and monitor, just studying things piecewise in the field. We'll have to continue to manage adaptively into the future.
Great, thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne. Pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
For 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I owe you maybe 2 minutes because we arrived a minute and a half late. So I'll try and be very concise in my intervention. I'd like to know, Dr. Hogg, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name properly, you stated that decisions are made in terms of measurements of pinnipeds, measurement of resources. So this is how guidelines are made, especially in Norway? Does this come from government, from people in the field, from indigenous people, and from fishers as well?
Understood it right, I think my answer is that all decisions on management are coming from the management authorities in Norway, but based on advice from institutes like Mine Institute, which is the Institute of Marine Research. We do the research and come up with the advice on how the population should be managed, and this is decided then by the Norwegian government, you could say.
Donc, on peut.
So, what you're telling us is that the government takes into account scientists who are in the field in various organizations who provide the measurements. Can this be comparable to Canada? Do you measure things more than Canada does, in your opinion?
Canada does, but the measurements done is primarily done by scientists, but we also get some results from measurements made by, for instance, whalers about blubber thickness that we use in our evaluation of how these whales are doing in the ecosystem. And as I told you in my first introduction, we have seen that blubber thickness has gone down in both harp seals and minke whales in the period when the cod stock increased. But after the cod stock started to decrease after 2015, we have seen, in fact, the opposite, that blubber thickness is getting thicker on minke whales, for instance. And we also have seen that there has been quite substantial decreases in pup production in some years of harp seals, both the two population and the harp seals that we have in our areas. And it seems to be the rule that when harp seals get too little to eat, their blubber becomes thinner, and the fertility of the females is reduced. Our Canadian colleagues have seen that if harp seals are not building up enough energy reserves in form of blubber, they may lose their pups in a so-called late-term abortions, which is a sign that you could say that the seal population is large enough in comparison with food available.
Okay. Dr. Lane?
Dr. Lane, do I still have a minute? Yes, Dr. Lane, you were quite clear in your observations and your evidence in terms of accountability. You're saying that the future of the resource, of the situation of fisheries in Canada, depends on decisions which will be taken. And you said it's too late for cod. Are there other species for which, if we did nothing at this point, which are at risk, in your opinion? Thank you for the question. Yes, you mentioned during a meeting last week, I think, that there are 4 species in particular that are moving towards extinction. And that's the evidence you have before you in terms of the impacts of seals. But yes, it's clear. It's always in that direction that there are problems. Don't forget that seals are apex predators in the marine ecosystem. And there are very few predators that consume them, which is a problem.
Go to Mr. Backrack for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to sit in in the place of my colleague, and thank you to the witnesses for your interesting testimony. I recognize that I'm jumping into this study rather late in the game. I am familiar with some of the issue, obviously representing Northwest BC, the health of our fisheries, and this debate over marine mammal populations and their potential impact on fish is something that many people are paying attention to. Perhaps I'll address my questions to Dr. Walters. Dr. Walters, you began by stating that you feel there are twice as many seals and sea lions on the coast as there have been in thousands of years. I'm wondering, because I've read elsewhere that there's a degree of uncertainty about the historical populations. I'm just wondering what data this conclusion is based on.
Yeah, one of DFO's scientists, Peter Elysiak, and then I've repeated it, did a back calculation of how big the seal population had to have been back around 1880, right after the second smallpox outbreak really decimated First Nations people. And that's based on adding back into the population backward over time the known removals by commercial harvesting and culling. And that calculation indicates that there were about half as many seals around in 1880, even after most of the First Nations hunting had stopped, there are today. So there's a lot of uncertainty in any back calculation like that. The data aren't that good, and we don't know exactly how productive the animals are, but all indications are from that and from calculations based on Aboriginal size of the Aboriginal population in BC and their likely consumption rates and the occurrence of bones from these animals in their middens and things like that, that they probably kept the populations down to well below half of what they are today.
I came across a report from a technical workshop at UBC in May of 2019. I imagine this was something you were involved in, given your expertise. But the summary of the workshop, the conclusions that they reached in looking into this issue of pinnipeds and their impact on fish populations were that the data are really insufficient, that we need better census data in terms of the number of pinnipeds that are out there. We need better pinniped diet data. We need to know more about the potential impact of pinnipeds on salmon and the fact that it depends on the proportion of seals and sea lions that are salmon specialists, something that we're not terribly knowledgeable about, and that we need to do more to test the alternative hypothesis, which is that it's bottom-up effects of food supply and food web competition that are primarily responsible for poor juvenile survival. I'm certain that you're familiar with these conclusions from this workshop. What do you make of them and the direction that they seem to be pointing in?
That workshop mostly consisted of marine mammal researchers. The agenda was strongly biased towards people out there doing marine mammal studies, and they want more money to do more research. None of the studies that they proposed would prove anything. This idea of an experiment that I've promoted, I would not make that proposal if the data that we can and have collected were sufficient to answer the questions or could ever be sufficient to answer the questions. The proof is in the pudding. We don't know what the responses will be. Or, like, for example, there's a hot topic in ecological research is called the ecology of fear. And that's studying how presence of predators can affect the behavior of their prey and make the prey hide basically more of the time and eat less and perform less well than they would if the predators weren't there. We've shown this in various experiments on a small scale. We have no idea at all how that ecology of fear is playing into the dynamics we're seeing out there, yet it certainly is a possibility. And I could list you a dozen other scientific things that just going out and making more measurements like these clowns recommended wouldn't do any good at all, wouldn't prove anything at all.
Are there examples of when in the past we've tried to control predators and have gotten it wrong and had impacts on other parts of the food web that weren't predicted at the outset? And what can we learn from those examples?
Yeah, there's been a history in the wolf control programs of not doing the control programs properly, not continuing to control long enough over time, or killing the wrong wolves and not controlling the wolves that control the behavior of wolves. And so those have failed to produce, in some cases, reasonable results. But there's just not a lot. There's not a lot of stuff where people have said, we need to treat what we're doing as an experiment and monitor it carefully and see compare it to the alternative as scientists would do in a control impact comparison experiment.
Finally, Dr. Walters, one of the
Mr. Beckwith, you're
I'm cut off.
You got 2 seconds left, so there's not enough to
in
get a question.
2 seconds is just long enough to say thank you, and I'll pass it back to the chair.
There you go. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. My first question is to Mr. Hogg. Mr. Hogg, you started by talking about the main principle in Norwegian management of seals and whales. So does Norway have a framework for managing marine mammal populations?
You mean management objectives?
Yes.
Yes, I think you could say that the objective is to keep them at a level where you can have a sustainable harvest from the populations that are harvested. We have 17 whale species in Norway, but only one is hunted. And we have 7 seal species, and only one, in fact, today is hunted on a commercial scale. So, and we have very clear rules for the hunt of both minke whales and harp seals that secures sustainable harvest. And that's it. In Norway, we don't have a culling program. We have seen that too much sealing can reduce the seal populations, as we have seen, for instance, for harp seals in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But when sealing became less profitable, the sealing more or less disappeared, and today there are only 1 to 3 seal vessels going out every year, and the numbers they take is very low.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg, for that. So you've a management protocol for marine mammals. What are the trade implications under Marine Mammal Protection Act for Norway, and Norway being the number 2 supplier for seafood in the U.S. market? Are there any trade implications in Norway for its harvesting of mammals, marine mammals?
No, not as far as I know. And the biggest problem, as we see it now in Norway, is that we need to reduce bycatches, and we do that. We are reduce bycatches of harbor porpoises by using pingers on the gill nets, and that's the only implications we have had of trade problems with the U.S. But our sealing and whaling has never been problematic in that respect.
Mr. Hogg, again, if you had the population of pinnipeds in Norway that we have in eastern Canada, close to 10 million pinnipeds, what do you think the effect would be on the seafood production in wild fish in Norway?
Well, it's a very complicated question because, as Carl Walters just said, the ecosystem and ecosystem models are terrible complicated, and so we know very little what will happen if we reduce the current populations to half of what they are today. And I think your question is impossible to answer.
Okay, so if your gray seal population on the Norwegian coast went from 5,000 gray seals to approximately 400,000, which we have in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, what would the Norwegian approach be to that?
I think the approach would be increased quotas in the hunt we already have for gray seals.
So I've got a question on seals and sea lions in estuaries and rivers. where salmon that are salmon habitats. What would happen in Norway if you had pinnipeds in your salmon rivers and estuaries? Would the Norwegian people put up with that, or would they take action?
It is legal to shoot harbor seals that goes up in salmon rivers. The problem is not very large in Norway because our numbers of what we call coastal seals, harbor seals and gray seals are quite low. And we have seen harbor seals going up in some salmon rivers.
All right.
And they can be shot.
Okay, so Mr. Hogg, on seals and cod prey, you say they prey on the same species, so there's a relationship. I guess capelin would be the main prey for seals and cod that they have in common. So if the harp seal population is decreased by half, what would be the effect on capelin and subsequently on cod?
Oh, again, very, very difficult to answer. Capelin is one important species for both cod and harp seals. But as you know, capelin fluctuates tremendously, both with and without harvest. So they have other options, and krill, a crustacean, is probably more important for seals than capelin is in most years.
Thank you. You're going a little bit over, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thanks to all the witnesses. And I want to ask some questions of you, first of all, Dr. Walters. And just to step back a little bit and get a bit of a better picture from your point of view on the relationship between salmon stocks and populations and pinnipeds. What do you think are the key factors leading to salmon mortality, and how important are pinnipeds in that dynamic in the West Coast ecosystem?
For the majority of BC salmon populations in general, they're not a big factor. The key problems are localized, particularly in the south coast of BC, where we have half of the total coastwide harbor seal population in the Georgia Strait, in a very small area. But we also have a concentration of Chinook and coho production from streams around the Georgia Strait and a very valuable fishery. And there's definitely conflict in that setting. Just roughly over the first ocean year of Chinook and coho, the marine mammal predation appears to account for between 30 and 50% of the total deaths of young salmon over their first year. And then returning adult salmon, up to about 20% of the adult salmon get eaten by seals and sea lions in estuaries as they're returning to their spawning rivers. We don't think that has a large impact. But yeah, when we first saw the salmon decline starting back in the 1980s, we thought we were dealing with an overharvest problem. In fact, even when we started to look at the declining survival rates in the first year of the ocean in Chinook and coho, we blamed those declining survival rates on factors other than marine mammals. It wasn't until almost 2000 before some of the data started to come out from Peter Olesiuk's lab in DFO that showed that how much the seal and sea lion populations had grown and how much they were consuming, that we really started to realize that this was a serious issue.
Thank you. So I think what you're saying is that it's more of a regional effect than an overall effect. So, and then I think, and correct me if I'm wrong when you answer, but the other aspect I wanted to ask you about is when you talked about the encouragement for opening up a little, somewhat the seal harvest, for instance, by removing commercial restrictions for First Nation seal harvesting, that then sustainable seal harvesting could have regional success in reducing salmon stocks. So that might be maybe the more important direction rather than trying to look for some overall population effect. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate. There is demand for, so the main need for a seal reduction is in the south coast area right off Vancouver. But there are also requests from First Nations people in the north who fear that that seals and sea lions are having a serious impact on a lot of small stream populations of particularly chum salmon that the First Nations people depend on up in the north for as a major food source. Unfortunately, we don't have any data to back this up. It's people saying that fish are disappearing and the seals and sea lions are everywhere. That kind of evidence, which isn't strong.
So how should we, while we could consider proceeding with what you call adaptive management of seals, which and there seems to be more and more consensus, certainly more opinion coming from this committee that's a direction that we should be moving towards. How do we measure? What's the best way to measure those unknown questions, but also the effects of what we would if we were to take on adaptive management more strongly? I guess very quickly, because I don't have a lot of time left.
The main method that we would use to monitor whether it's succeeding is that we monitor the first ocean year survival rates of a set of stocks directly using what's called codewire tagging. We tag a large number of small fish and then look at how many make it back. That would be the first indicator that we were successful. It would be improvement in those survival rates. We also monitor spawning escapements and we monitor harvests, and those spawning runs should and harvest should improve within just a few years after reduction starts.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to ask a question of Dr. Lane. Could you tell us, in your view, the most important tool to use to take an enlightened decision for pinniped management? Thank you for the question. Ms. Demia, in terms of a decision, do you mean if yes or no we need to take care? Is it the measurement of the resource, of the measurement of its state of health? Should we invest more in measurement in order to make informed decisions? Or have the measurements been taken and are they conclusive, and do we have to move to something else? As we said earlier, as other witnesses said, we need to measure things. It's important to see what's going on in the marine ecosystem. But here we have an opportunity. Here we have an industry that's beginning to harvest seals. We can put scientists who would work with the people who are harvesting seals, and they can measure because they can see exactly what's going on. So they're present and they really have an opportunity to see what's going on, and that's what's important. But I also believe that there is an opportunity at the same time, and it's a socio-economic opportunity to use a resource that's there for us, to use it to assess the situation, to put people at work, to give people work, to for economic gains, but also there's an idea that there are health products that are there. It seems to me we have to do something to use the resource to see what's happening elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. Lane.
Mr. Backrack for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And continuing with my questions for Dr. Walters, I'm curious whether there's a correlation between areas that have a large population of pinnipeds and the recovery or decline of specific salmon stocks in those areas. One of the examples that's been noted is the Cowichan River Chinook. And there's a large, high abundance of pinnipeds in the area surrounding the Cowichan River, and yet we're seeing Chinook stocks on the rebound. Have you looked into a correlation between particularly high densities of pinnipeds and the trend of salmon populations in those areas?
Well, just on a general coastwide basis from Washington all the way up to Alaska, the problem areas where stocks are declining are also the areas where marine mammal densities are highest. I'm just doing an analysis of the Cowichan River, which is really interesting because we calculate that there were large and growing pinniped impacts on the Cowichan stock's first ocean year survival rate that proceeded up to the 1990s. And then there was a reversal in the Cowichan stock, and it unexpectedly built up very rapidly. The calculations that we've done on that stock and the different life stages suggested the main reason for its recovery, despite continued marine mammal predation, was a substantial improvement in freshwater survival conditions because of habitat restoration efforts.
With the permission of the chair to sneak in a second question, which is that I know that salmon hatcheries concentrate the returns and releases of salmon, and I wonder if this makes them particularly vulnerable to pinniped predation, and if so, what the implications might be for the federal government's efforts under PSSI to build new hatcheries on our coast.
The pinnipeds have definitely learned about these concentrated hatchery releases, and they show up the day before the hatchery releases and they pound the juvenile fish coming out of the hatcheries. But that, as far as we know, only takes a relatively small percentage of the total smolts released. Hatchery juveniles, just in general, survive at only about half the rates of natural juvenile salmon that are better adapted to deal with predation risk of all sorts right from day one. The dumb ones get knocked out while they're rearing under natural conditions with high predation risk. So the bottom line is that it's a complicated mixture of impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. You're got a little bit over time. Ms. Barron will be proud of you. Now, we've got about 2 minutes left in this hour, so I don't know if Mr. Perkins wants to ask a question in that 2 minutes, or we'll move on to let our witnesses go and then introduce the new witnesses. All right, one quick one, please.
Okay. Mr. Hogue, I'd like to ask you a question. We had a DFO official here at the beginning of the study and is coming again in a little while, and I'll quote from her. She said, "Our objective is not to reduce the seal population, just like other fisheries where we try to keep our fish at a very high and heavy levels." When you look at the numbers that Mr. Small said earlier, from our gray seal population at over 400,000 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million seals in the various other species, I'd say it's the only species that DFO is managing successfully to keep at a high level. Might that be the reason why all our other fish stocks are in such massive decline here?
Yeah, it's tempting to believe that, but I don't know enough about your fish populations that I can give you a firm answer on that.
I'll fill you in. There were 2.7 million harp seals at the time of the cod collapse in 1991, and now there's over 8 million. Could that be a contributor to what's going on in our waters?
Yeah, I would guess so, yes. I would guess so, yes. Because we have seen exactly the opposite, We have seen an increasing cod population and harp seals that, have some problems.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. I want to say thank you to Dr. Lane, Dr. Hogg, and Dr. Walters for participating with their witness testimony today to the committee and for sharing your knowledge with us. We'll suspend for a moment now while we switch out and start the second panel as quickly as possible. Again, thank you. Suspend for a moment. Welcome our witnesses for the second panel. From the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we have Cedric Arsenault, Director of Maglinon's Area Quebec Region by video conference, and also by video conference we have Andrew Thompson, Regional Director of Fisheries Management. Here in person we have Jennifer Bowie, Acting Director General Fisheries Resource Management, and Simon Nadeau, Director Marine Mammals and Biodiversity Science. We'll now allow for the opening remarks for 5 minutes or less. I don't know who's doing them or if you're sharing them. Okay, when you're ready, please.
Bonjour and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Again, my name is Jennifer Bowie, and I'm the Acting Director General of Fisheries Resource Management at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. My colleagues and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee on behalf of the department. I think everybody's been introduced. The Minister is committed to supporting sustainable and prosperous fisheries through the use of science and evidence-based decision-making. Accordingly, Fisheries and Oceans Canada manages its fisheries with the goal of keeping stocks healthy, protecting biodiversity and fisheries habitats, and ensuring our fisheries remain productive. The department manages the seal harvest using the same approach as all other commercially managed fisheries, working to ensure seal populations remain above a precautionary population level to ensure sustainability. Management decisions are based on the best available information, including peer-reviewed science and Indigenous knowledge.
From 2018 to 2022, annual harp seal landings averaged 7% per year out of a population of 425,000 seals, according to the latest scientific advice. gray seal harvests were even lower, an average of 1% out of a population of 77,300 seals, according to the latest science evidence. However, preliminary reports for 2023 from the harp and gray seal hunts indicate increased landings, approximated 9.5% and 2% of the science levels.
Demand for seal seen this year, but generally the lack of market opportunities for seal products has led to fewer removals. The department is aware of the concerns from commercial fish harvesters about the impact of seals on fish stocks. However, Canada's fisheries management framework is not intended to be used as a tool to reduce populations. Fisheries and Oceans Canada is continuously improving its understanding of seal populations and potential impacts on fish stocks through surveys and targeted research projects, such as studies on diet and reproduction. Currently, there is only a single area where the department has scientific evidence supporting the negative impact of seal predation on commercial fish stocks. Scientific evidence has not been found linking harp seal predation to the current abundance of northern cod stocks in Newfoundland. Similarly, the department does not have evidence of pinniped predation as a key driver in Pacific salmon declines. Research, however, continues, and increasingly the department seeks to integrate a greater number of ecosystem factors, such as oceanographic conditions and predation, into its stock assessments. The department's commitment to seal-related science was also demonstrated by its establishment of the Atlantic Seal Science Task Team to gather input on science activities and programs related to seals and their role in the ecosystem in Atlantic Canada and Quebec. The task team's report was published in 2022, and one of its recommendations was a seal forum to bring together experts, which the minister did on November 8th to 9th in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. The purpose of the Seal Summit was to explore new opportunities to expand Canada's seal products into export markets, to highlight the importance of the seal harvest to Indigenous communities, and to help address gaps in data regarding seal populations. At the conclusion of the Seal Summit, the Minister announced an open call for project proposals to increase our understanding of the role of seals in the ecosystem. DFO Science is currently reviewing proposals received under this initiative. The department will continue to advance scientific research on seals, guided by the recommendations from the task team, and we will look at ways to further collaborate with industry in science activities. On the margins of the summit, the Atlantic Seals Advisory Committee also met. The committee is the primary consultative body for the management and development of the Atlantic seal harvest. A notable outcome of committee discussions was the establishment of a working group to review the policies and regulations that govern licensing aspects regarding the seal harvest. The review will determine what changes could be made to facilitate participation in and reduce barriers to the harvest. The working group has met multiple times and is on track to report to the Atlantic Seals Advisory Committee at its fall meeting. While these developments are a cause for optimism, such much work needs to be done to achieve a seal harvest that is not only sustainable, but prosperous. The department is firmly committed to playing a role alongside our Indigenous partners and industry to advance this objective. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to answer your questions now.
On to our first round of questioning. We'll start off with Mr. Small for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is to Ms. Buey. Why does DFO have a picture of a white coat on its webpage when the white coat is such a short period in the life cycle of a harp seal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I actually don't know why we have a picture of a white coat. You're right. It's a very short part of a seal's life. So certainly can follow up and work with communications on that.
Thank you, Ms. Buey, for your answer. We just had testimony from a Norwegian scientist, and they talked about Norway's framework for managing not just pinnipeds, but marine mammals, seals and whales. And it's very important to them, and their fishery is so much more productive than Canada's. Why can your department not have a similar policy and have a framework for management of pinnipeds? Why don't we have it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. We do have a framework for managing pinnipeds. It's part of our sustainable management of all of our fisheries in Canada. We want to ensure that there's a harvest that continues to be accessible to our sealing community. And that's why we apply the precautionary approach to ensure that our seals are managed sustainably.
Thank you, Ms. Bowie. But it seems that Norway has a bit of a different management approach in that they look at how high that population should be and how low it should be, whereas our management approach is to look at making sure that our population is not too high. But looking back at in the last meeting, and the main objective in the managing pinnipeds is to keep the population healthy, and looks like it's a success story. In terms of health of seal populations, but that Norwegian scientist that we just heard from, Mr. Hogg, he said that seals and cod prey on basically the same species. So would you think that if cod populations are low and seal populations are high, if one goes up, one goes down, so wouldn't that be a factor in you wanting to increase the health of the cod stocks in the off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I mean, I think that that's certainly a consideration that we take into account when we're making decisions around total allowable catches for our seal harvest. I mean, that is part of our science examination of both seals and cod, and where there might be a relationship. And perhaps I can turn to my colleague, Dr. Nadeau, to add anything to that response.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to turn my time over to Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to use my time right now to move a motion that was put on notice on April 28th, and that being that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of 1 2-hour meeting to examine how the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, within its role as the machinery of government agent for the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, allocates resources to the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission in execution of Canada's commitments under the 1954 Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries, and the working relationship between the Department and Fisheries and Oceans and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission in the delivery of the Convention's 5 major charges for the Commission. That the committee call senior officials from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission to appear as witnesses concurrently. That the committee present its conclusions and recommendations in a report to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, that the committee request the government table a comprehensive response to this report. I bring this motion forward, Mr. Chair, because we have been basically playing a tennis match between what we hear from DFO and what is actually delivered through the mechanism right now, with not all of the funds going to the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. We've heard testimony from DFO officials, heard further from Great Lakes Fisheries Commission that the initial testimony was incorrect, brought DFO back in. They said something further. Great Lakes Fisheries Commission had a counter to that. We, as a committee, have already spent, I think, as members, individual members, going back and forth a lot on this, and even in this committee meetings. So I propose that we do this, have them both in at the same time, so that we can minimize the impact on our work as a committee, and hopefully work towards a solution to this situation that's become an irritant, such an irritant, that the U.S. Counterparts in the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission have withdrawn from the budgetary process. And I'll pass it on to, I believe Mr. Epp has even further information on this if he'd like to add.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I could speak ad nauseum as to the series of communications of frustration that have come from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission from the Canadian section, and most recently I've been corresponding with the American section, who have reached out to me as well. The United Council of Advisors on April the 25th published a media release and a statement that chronicled 3 years of frustration with the Canadian government, initially over financing. And actually, what's interesting now is we're to the point, or the pressure built to the point that the Minister of Finance did address Canada's shortfall that had been ongoing since 2001, only to have it not flow through to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. I have much more I could say, but I'm hoping that we can deal with this and not waste a lot of the committee's time. Thank you.
Hardy.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I share the frustration and the uncertainty of what we've heard, because a former colleague of ours is working with the Commission and has been critical of Canada's response and its follow-through. That said, though, we'd like to propose an amendment to Mr. Arnold's motion that we undertake a study of a minimum of 3 two-hour meetings, and that we invite the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the chair of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to appear as witnesses separately and not concurrently. We think that there could be far more productive, review and analysis rather than have the two of them getting into a sparring match in front of our very eyes. So that's the amendment that we're proposing.
Okay, so, yes, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Can I ask a question? Why 3? Did you have some other witnesses in addition to those 2 that you'd like to hear from?
Well, I think that, we should hear from our folks, as well as from Global Affairs, because Global Affairs has been cited by the Commission as perhaps a better, a better management focus for this relationship, given that the U.S. Secretary of State is the one that, looks at things from the American side. So hear from our people, hear from the U.S. side, and then bring our people back in to really sort out, okay, we've heard this now. What is your response to that, so that we get a complete understanding? We could be open to a 2-meeting session, if that's going to be sufficient. But, we think that that's probably more productive in terms of really getting to the root of it, rather than as I say, a bun toss between the 2 sides that we've witnessed all along.
Mr. Ripp.
Yeah, I'm curious why the length of time is needed, because the advisors, the commission have written for 3 years and complained that there has been no government response. Do you think it's an issue that the government doesn't know what's going on? Is that the issue? Because the commission has written, and again, that press release outlined 8 points correspondence and have had radio silence in return. So I'm trying to understand, is it an ignorance of the issue that you're trying to get at? Because I guess, not having spent a lot of time at this committee, I certainly have a wealth of information that I've received.
Well, I think that, from this side, certainly I would want Vance Badaway, our MP, who's been very, very vocal on, the issues in the Great Lakes, to participate with us, because, like you, he's well invested in this. I get the sense from what we've seen indirectly over the past Lord knows how many months, that there's a disagreement about the value in kind, for instance, of work that the Canadian side is doing, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you may take issue with this, but on the government side, we're not as heavily invested as you've been, and so in order for us to really do our due diligence, we need to maybe take a few steps that you've already taken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure on which stage we are at. I proposed a motion. Mr. Hardy proposed an amendment, so we're discussing his amendment. Mr. Hardy, we have in response to Mr. Hardy, we have a very full agenda already between now and June, and even full after the summer recess. we proposed one meeting to get the two parties in the same room at the same time, because we continuously play this back and forth of he said this, they said that, they said this, they said that. In the best use of our committee's valuable time, I believe it's very important that we have both parties in the same room so that we can reduce the amount of back and forth that we've continuously seen on this issue for a number of years now. And even your party members have seen that. Mr. Badaway is well aware of what's taken place here. Be more than happy to have him as one of your committee members during this. And I think he could brief all of you, your party members, quite quickly on what's taking place here. So I'll move a sub-amendment to Mr. Hardy's. We've proposed one meeting. You've proposed three. I would propose a sub-amendment to your amendment that we compromise at two meetings, but we do have the DFO officials and the Great Lakes Fisheries appear concurrently.
First, I have to go to Mr. Perkins, Mr. Backrack, Mr. Repp, and then back to Mr. Arnold. Mr. Hardy.
Whoops.
It was a good weekend.
The weekend cell phone was still on. Sorry about that. And speaking, I guess, to the sub-amendment to the amendment, is that what I'm speaking? I think what I was planning to say is still relevant. When I was first elected in 2021 in my first meeting and appointed fisheries critic then, my first meeting with the minister, I raised this issue. In her first appearance before this committee, I raised the issue. In letters to her after that meeting, I raised this issue with her, in addition to everything Mr. Epp's been doing. In response to that, the minister said in committee that she believed that the government should pay its bills, which the evidence is pretty striking that it has not been in terms of what the treaty obligation is. In last year's budget in 2022, there was a bragging allocation of solid funding that would finally be committed to the commission, to the extent that the minister then in June went on Lake Erie and made a big to-do out of the fact that they were finally going to get all the money that the treaty obliges the government to do, and then they didn't get it. How do we know that? Because before this committee, not too long ago, the Great Lakes Fisheries Committee said they didn't get it. In a meeting around that at the same time, the officials said they did get it. And so if we just do that again, we're going to get the same result again when we have them separately. He said, she said, as Mr. Arnold said, that's all we keep getting is a runaround from the officials. So put the two in the room together and let's sort this out. So I support it being reduced to two because we have an important study coming up on corporatization of the fishery. We need to get on with that and finish this study. And I would suggest that if we have two meetings, that an additional witness in addition to global affairs would be the American side of the commission as well.
Okay, Mr. Backrack.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was, prior to Mr. Arnold proposing his sub-amendment, I was going to do the same as a very obvious compromise between the two offerings. So I'm happy to support that proposal on behalf of Lisa Marie.
Okay. Mr. Repp.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on a comment that Mr. Hardy expressed is, as far as is the difference of agreement between how the money is calculated into meeting Canada's share. This is no longer a money issue. This is strictly a governance issue. I OPQ'd how the money flowed. I have 11 pages of spreadsheets. This should operate. It's an international treaty since 1954 to address something that could not be addressed by 8 states and a province and all the territories. The International Joint Commission works. Why does it work? Because in the main estimates to global affairs, there's one line, the transfer. The DFO does, by all accounts, a remarkable job on the work as the contractee of the Commission. Where the problem is on the governance side. That's what we need to get to the bottom of. That's where all the calls, almost unanimous, I can't say that word, you know what I mean though, including from a good share of your own caucus, if I may be so bold, is to fix the problem of governance. We don't have to get into numbers. It's not a numbers issue.
Mr. Morrissey.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I agree with everything that's being said here today, but how as a member of the committee, I want some assurance. I'm not interested in sitting through an hour or two of he said, she said, finger pointing. Because unlike Mr. Repp and some of the others, Mr. Badway from our side, I don't know the issue well. And so to have two, how do we blend the two very competing interests in one meeting? Because an hour or two of finger pointing will have been a waste of time as well. Not to mention another meeting. So I'm willing to listen to how you would see the actual meeting taking place if they're both going to be sitting down at the end of this table glaring at one another. I'm lost. I'm not sure we could spend a lot of time. Chair, you're a great chair, but I need a.
That actually is the exact.
Till you're
No, it's
recognized,
fine.
please.
Unless I'm looking for answers. Yeah, okay.
Mr. Hardy.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, and my suspicions align with yours, Mr. Epp. We need to know for sure, and I think that an opportunity to hear both sides without, as I say, a big bun toss in the middle of the room would be a useful way for us to determine for ourselves what is and what isn't, and then what comes out of it should be a durable resolution. Rather than just, assigning blame or responsibility. So, again, 2 meetings, perfect, maybe an hour with our officials, an hour with the Great Lakes, the group, and then in the second session, we bring our people back in and say, okay, what are you going to do to fix this? Or can we determine for ourselves if something needs to be fixed? I share your suspicion that something needs to be fixed, but I'd like to really give everybody a good and adequate hearing, which to me means that we hear from them separately, but then bring our people back in and bring up the gaps where there's either a difference in understanding or just simply a management issue as you propose, that, and then we ask them, well, what are you going to do to fix this? So that's really where we're at, and that's the substance of the amendment that we're offering. We accept Mr. Arnold's proposal for 2 meetings. That's a friendly. So it really comes down then to a matter of is it concurrent or do we hear them separately?
Mr. Arnold.
I may be able to save us some time so we can get back to our witnesses here. If I was to withdraw my sub-amendment and Mr. Hardy withdrew his amendment, that we simply change the original motion to having 2 meetings. Where is it? And then we can't guarantee that they're going to agree to appear at the same time, but I think it's something we should ask for.
Mr. Ripp.
I think it's critical that they both be in the same room, because right now how it flows is from Treasury through DFO to Commission back to DFO. And if that relationship is evidenced in front of us as not working, if it works, that is a big step. If it's not working, isn't that what we need to know as well? Because, I mean, there's legal opinions that point out the structural conflict of interest that the DFO commissioners are in when they serve on the commission. So there's all that. So if that relationship is evident to our eyes, that they can't work in front of a parliamentary committee, how are they supposed to work well in the back rooms?
Mr. Hardy, please.
Well, I think that the Commission's position and their suspicions and your suspicions are already pretty well established. I don't know that any further hearing about that will really create that much, other than for us to ask the Commission's question about the position that the DFO is taking in all of this. So, I mean, 2 meetings, okay. Concurrently, no, we don't think that's a good idea. So maybe we can just call the question then, Mr. Chair.
Go to Mr. Arnold first.
I have a question for Mr. Hardy. When you referred to calling our people back in to clarify what was said, who are you referring to as our people?
Our people would be the DFO, the people that should be responsible for delivering the funding.
Then I disagree with that. I believe it needs to be DFO officials appearing first.
Them first. Then the commission, and then DFO back.
So you're going to have, you're proposing having the back and forth tennis match again that we've already experienced meeting after meeting after meeting and year after year after year. That's why we said bring them into the same room at the same time and save this committee's time in avoiding having that independent and back and forth tennis match taking place.
We really haven't had, I think, sufficient hearings to bring all of us up to speed, the speed that Mr. Epp or Mr. Badaway might have. So yeah, we don't agree with the concurrent piece, Mel, but we'll call that question and see what the committee would like to do.
Okay, Mr. Reynolds.
If I can, if we're going to have two meetings, then probably the first two meetings should be hearing from the U.S. counterparts and others to give the background, and then the second meeting with DFO and then Great Lakes Fisheries Council.
Oh, Mr. Hardy.
We could agree to a separate hearing from the commission, then perhaps to bring in, like, for 1 hour, because the story seems to be fairly simple. Bring the DFO officials in for a second hour, and then, we go to a second meeting. Yeah, why not maybe think of bringing them both in at the same time and resolve it that way? But at least we'll get the foundational stuff that some of us really need in order to appreciate the full extent of this thing.
Mr. Reynolds.
If we can agree to two meetings then, and then we can hash out the appearance order and get an indication from the parties involved as to whether they will or not. So we'd include global affairs and the U.S. counterparts.
So everybody all right with that? Two meetings, we'll hash out who's appearing at which one, or whether it's concurrent or together. Okay, I'm seeing, Madame Debienne?
I'd like to know, this is anticipated to be when, these two meetings? Is it 2 meetings or 2 hours?
The business meeting on the 4th. That might be a good time to try and see what the schedule is like and to say which 2 meetings we're going to allocate for this particular intervention.
So it's all good.
Everybody okay with it? Yeah. Okay, I see thumbs up from Mr. Backrack. So I'm going to assume everybody else is okay with it because they've been talking about it this past 20 minutes. Okay, so where are we to on questioning?
We're finished our time.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are going to be more generalized to Madame Bouet. Bouet. Oh, very, very East Coast. Bouet. Why? And we've been hearing a lot of testimony in this committee. We've had numerous meetings. Various committees have heard the issue before. My question, can you give an opinion on why the industry, why people in the fishery is so suspect of DFO signs? It's almost universal. With the witness coming, there's been three areas come down here in this report so far. There is the ministry, which should be objective. We've had scientists from various NGOs, arm's length agencies, were sunken there. But from the fisher themselves that appear before and the harvesters, they're not complimentary to the veracity of the science on this issue within DFO. Opinion, if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. We do have a very robust advisory committee process. We had the SEAL Summit back in November. And so we do hear a lot from our stakeholder community about what they're seeing on the water. And oftentimes they're seeing different things. For example, large pools of fish that are currently under moratorium, or, other things that are different from what our DFO science is reporting on. I mean, from a management perspective, our job is to consider all sources of information, but at the end, it's the science, the evidence-based outcomes of their science processes that are helping to drive our decision-making around fisheries management. So, I think that we always provide opportunity for industry and other stakeholders to provide their views, but
they tell this committee, but then it doesn't get listened to. That's the testimony that they're giving.
Understood.
It does not seem to have any meaningful impact on the decisions that come down.
In our fisheries management decisions, as I said, we do rely on the empirical, evidence-based results from science processes that are peer-reviewed, and do rely on the expertise of not only our science, but on...
You acknowledge, sitting before this committee, that your science is 100%. It gives an accurate, beyond reproach perspective of the state of the oceans, east and west?
Well, I would say that management is continually evolving. For example, we're looking at ways to incorporate more of an ecosystem-based approach to management.
Has your science failed in the past? Has your science failed on a fishery recommendation?
As I said, our science is always providing the best knowledge at any given point in time to make our decisions.
Okay, I know it's a difficult position, but this committee heard a lot of frustration from harvesters, indigenous harvesters, from fishers, that the department is not taking the threat seriously, and the substantial growth in all reference to East Coast seal herd, it has the potential to have a very, I won't use the word catastrophic, but a significant impact on some stock, already has, and will on some others that are the lifeblood of rural Atlantic communities. So my question is, from your notes, currently there's only a single area where the department has scientific evidence supporting the negative impact of seal predation. Where's that?
That's in Southern Gulf.
Specific, Southern Gulf's a big area.
Sort of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, what they call the NAFO Division 4T.
And what species and what fish stock is it?
Cod.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, yeah, that's right. So in my closing question time, what could you recommend to the committee that governments must do differently to see results from other jurisdictions like Norway, and we keep getting models pointed to where they've had a successful balance? Because something that concerned me was in your statement as well. You made a management tool of DFO is not to reduce herds. That concerns me as an East Coast politician, when we've had clearly documented dramatic growth in the seal herd in Atlantic Canada. I don't think anybody's disputing the fact that it's having an impact on fish stocks, and could eventually move into fish stocks where they're currently not having, like lobster or crab. They will eat them. And we're also told when they run out of one food source, they will move to another. So I'm a bit puzzled as why a management tool, when other jurisdictions use it, DFO does not have a management tool to reduce a herd that is having an obvious negative impact. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. We'll now go to Madam Debian, but somebody is telling me there's a vote called, I guess. Okay, do we know if it's 30-minute bells or 30 minutes? Okay, so with permission of the committee, we'll continue on, and we'll expire our time long before the vote comes up, but anyone can do it by phone then or whatever, because not only is there a 30-minute bell, there's a 10-minute voting time frame as well if we're doing it on our phones. So we'll continue on as per normal. So over to you, Madam Debian, for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. It's highly appreciated. Ms. Bouy, earlier you said that DFO was ensuring offering the chance to fisheries in Canada and Quebec to be productive. If nothing is done to regulate fish and to regulate the equilibrium between prey and predator, how could we, in an ethical way, in a sustainable way, that's our first concern, how can we ensure fisheries productivity?
For the question. I mean, in terms of assuring productivity, that is part of our precautionary approach to fisheries management. So we want to ensure that the stocks are continually being maintained in a healthy state to ensure that we can harvest them in a sustainable manner. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, something that, you know, we're looking at and starting to use more in our fishery management decisions is sort of that ecosystem approach to fisheries management, where we're looking at it at a little bit of a grander scale. We don't yet have the tools to manage fisheries in that fashion. And we continue to use our sustainable fisheries framework as the foundation for which fisheries management decisions are taken. But that's one way in the future, once we get further scientific evidence, once we understand those relationships within the ecosystem, because it's quite complex. And we don't understand what the interplay is between some of those species, and if one is removed, what will happen? Will another species come in and take its place? We just don't know. And that's why we do really rely on the scientific information of today, what we have, in order to make sound, robust decisions about our fisheries.
Do you think you have enough data, enough measurements? Would more measurements and more data help you more?
That, you know, based on our sustainable fisheries framework, we do have the information in order to manage seals for sustainable harvest. But when I mentioned about ecosystem, about all those facets of how to manage at an ecosystem level, I think that is where we would rely more on needed scientific evidence of where there are those relationships in the ecosystem. So we're starting to explore that as a department, as a management tool, but we're not there yet.
The amount of time that you're anticipating, because a lot of people talked about the urgency of acting. We're seeing fish disappear, herring, fisheries. Some people said that they even found lobster in pinniped feeding or food. Is this a variable, becoming a variable that you can't avoid?
It's about putting out a call for proposals on science, and maybe I can turn to my colleague here to speak to that. But that's part of that progression forward to understanding better some of those perhaps science needs that we have to more to develop a better system of understanding of what role seals are playing in the ecosystem. So perhaps I can turn to my colleague for further details.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. Yes, we sent out an RFP last fall, which drew 25 applications to study the role of seals in the ecosystem. We're finalizing the approval of these projects. And we're also undertaking a new project this year, which is going to look at the gray seal impact. in various fishery management zones in the Atlantic. And also in the ecosystemic approach mentioned by Ms. Buey, we're trying to better understand the impact of the seal on cod on the Nova Scotia shelf. So in terms of when this will be done, could you tell us how long will these new data lead to something concrete to tell our fishers to not worry more or to worry more about it? Well, this is in terms of management, it's always concrete, but science is always a work in progress. It's constantly improving, and ecosystemic conditions are always changing. So, what the situation 20 years ago is not what we have now, and is not what we'll have in 20 years. So we're always running after our target, but we're carrying out new studies that allow us to better understand the effect of seals in the ecosystem. But we have no calendar for this. No, we don't. No timelines.
I will now go to Mr. Backrack for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses. This is a very interesting topic. My questions focus mostly on British Columbia because that's where I'm from, and obviously I have a particular interest in the situation there. And hearing the contrast between your testimony and that of Dr. Walters, I think is interesting to the committee. I'm curious, you've highlighted the lack of conclusive evidence pointing towards pinnipeds, if I wrote it down correctly, evidence that pinnipeds are the key driver of West Coast salmon declines. What key data are missing to inform that question?
If I may, I'll take that question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. It's Andrew Thompson. I'm the Regional Director of Science for Pacific Region. So we continue to do, I would say, a multivariate study as to the key factors for particular salmon stocks. We have one ongoing right now for West Coast spot, Vancouver Island Chinook, and to assist in understanding rebuilding plans for them. So, I think there's a wide variety of research avenues in which we're trying to understand what are the drivers for some of our salmon populations in decline. As Dr. Walters said earlier, a Cowichan River is a good example where habitat impacts is one of the key drivers for that particular stock. It tends to be variable depending on the stock, depending on the area, and of course, depending on the life history of the salmon.
Mr. Thompson, I'm curious about various assertions about the population abundance of pinnipeds, and you indicated that you're doing research on drivers of salmon abundance, but I'm wondering, when it comes to the abundance of pinnipeds, we've heard the view that there are as many as twice as many pinnipeds as historically, and then we've heard another view, or there's certainly another view out there, that pinnipeds in British Columbia are recovering from historic levels. What do the peer-reviewed studies indicate when it comes to pinniped density and abundance?
Thank you very much for that question. We've in the department, we've conducted aerial surveys of pinniped populations since the 1970s. Currently, our estimate from 2019 for harbor seals is about 85,000 harbor seals in British Columbia. That's slightly down from the peak of over 100,000 in the early 2000s. Similarly, we're seeing about 43,200 stellar sea lions, which is an increase over 2013, but has been relatively stable since 2017, and an estimate of about 13,600 California sea lions, which again has been an increase since the 2009 survey, but not a significant increase since 2017.
And does DFO have any comparison to historic population abundance for seals and sea lions on the BC coast?
As I understand, sort of the historic population from the 1960s was around 100,000 as well.
for harbor seals. I don't have the data in front of me for the other ones, but we do have some past surveys. But of course, we've been trying to bring greater rigor to our survey methodology through these aerial surveys that we've been conducting since 1970s.
Okay, for the RFP that has been put out for additional research on these topics, what proportion of the proposals have dealt with the West Coast versus the East Coast?
I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but maybe one of my colleagues does. I understand a number of proposals that come forward from West Coast, both universities and Indigenous groups, and I've seen some of those proposals, yes.
And maybe I'll try to ask this a little bit more pointedly. On the West Coast, what are the key questions that we need to answer?
There's a lot of questions that we're still looking at, both within DFO and I think with others, is trying to understand what is the ecosystem impacts of pinniped predation. As we know, pinnipeds obviously consume salmon. That's not an issue of debate. It's the proportion of which they consume salmon, whether or not they're consuming other predators of salmon. So, for instance, the majority of seals consume more hake than they do salmon. And hake, we know, is a predator of salmon, of juvenile salmon. So you're trying to understand that ecosystem impact. We're also looking at the way we conduct these studies. So we're moving from just scat analysis of seals to more fatty acid analysis, which might give us a longer time frame of the data and not just a single point data. So there's, I'd say, multiple avenues we're pursuing to try and get a much better understanding of the role of seals and pinnipeds generally in British Columbia and their impact potentially on salmon populations and other populations within the ecosystem.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. My understanding is that DFO historically has targeted marine mammals. Maybe I'm incorrect with that assertion, but I'm wondering, in past management approaches, has there been an effort from DFO historically to control marine mammal populations, and how has that worked out?
Well, in the long history past, in the prior to 1960s and in the 1960s, I understand there was some cull programs tried. I don't have all the data as to those programs in the distance past. I would think the most recent example would be in 1997, 1998. There was a cull of 55 seals in the Puntledge River that was conducted by the department that looked at seals that were consuming salmon in that area.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. And we'll go now to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Ms. Buie. In 2020, legislation was brought in by this current government to outlaw the euthanizing of nuisance pinnipeds because our seafood markets were being threatened under the MMPA. Now, Norway is the #2 supplier of seafood to the United States, and today we had a Norwegian scientist here telling us that their management of marine mammals, seals and whales, have no impacts on their trade relations with the U.S. They have a policy of automatic euthanization of seals in rivers, estuaries, and aquaculture facilities. Why is your department so fearful of the MMPA boogeyman versus Norway's fearlessness towards that threat?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this question. I would say that, part of the consideration is that the MMPA does not outlaw our regulated commercial seal hunt. It is only regarding the unintentionally killing of marine mammals as it undertakes other commercial fishing activities. So in terms of our seal hunt, there is no question that the MMPA does not apply to that. We can continue with a well-regulated seal hunt, which has a very large total allowable catch. And we can continue to export our more lucrative seafood products such as lobster and crab to the U.S. I can't speak to Norway's position, but we continue to manage our seal hunt the way we are.
To the same witness, Mr. Chair, as a follow-up on that, the United States has allowed the culling, and we're not suggesting culling of seals, but the U.S. has allowed culling on the Columbia River of sea lions, over 9,000 animals now we've heard at this committee, and they've seen a return of Pacific salmon. So they've actually done something that's resulted in change and restoration of stock. Your answers so far have been, well, we don't have enough information, so we'll just do the status quo and not do anything until we have more and more science. We've got about 30 years of science, and I can go over some of that with you if you like. But why is it that a do-nothing strategy will show us some way forward that an actual action strategy of trying something does not?
Well, I think we do have an action strategy, and that strategy is to get the scientific information that we need in order to undertake another avenue. So far, as I mentioned, the only place that we have direct evidence where there is an impact of predation is on gray seals on southern Gulf cod.
Which a DFO scientist came out a few years ago and said it will be extinct if we don't do anything, yet nothing happens. DFO has not done anything to deal with that issue. And earlier in your testimony, you said that there's no evidence that they even eat cod. Well, I can give you lots of pictures of seals eating cod. There's tons of evidence. There are commissions going back to the 90s. In fact, former Fisheries Minister Brian Tobin in 1995 said the only one still fishing cod, his name is Harp and his name is seal. And there are Fishery Council reports, scientific reports done for DFO going back as far as the 1990s, yet your only rationale as the manager of seals is that we need to leave them alone and we need to do more study. We've had 30 years of scientific studies. I've got right here 122 pages of DFO on seal stomach samples that have been done all over Atlantic Canada in only 5 years. There's no excuse right now for DFO to continue to say, we need more evidence. There's lots of evidence. I don't know why the department won't do what they've done in the United States under the Marine Mammal Protection Act to try and restore the biodiversity balance in the Columbia River, why you won't take the same approach here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I think, you know, in the Canadian context, we have a very robust and open total allowable catch for harps. The question is, if we could take out the number of harp seals, for example, up to 425,000 harps a year, there could be, I don't know for sure, an impact on the population of harp seals. The question is, though, that there is not the market available to our Canadian sealers.
Because the government won't do anything about it. The government doesn't promote it. The government doesn't defend the industry.
We'll now go to Mr. Fournier for 5 minutes or less to finish up, please.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought the time was expired, so je vais aller en français.
So I'll speak French a little bit to go on in the same vein as my colleagues. We often use, on the official side, the following excuse, that if we do things incorrectly, if we have a seal hunt or something, whatever way we'll take to reduce the seal population, that it could have an impact on our markets, be it crab, lobster, etc. And it seems that that's the easy excuse. Is that your concern? Is that the only reason why we can't go ahead with a more rigorous control of the seal population? I would just like to have an answer to that question.
The question, again, I know I'm sounding repetitive, but again, where there is scientific evidence that promotes a healthy and abundant seal population, we manage this species for a commercial seal harvest. And there is active harvest. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we saw that this year that there was an increase in landings of up to 9.5% compared to previous years. So, I think that the position of the department has always been that we are supportive of harvesters' interests in the seal hunt. And perhaps I can quickly turn to my colleague in the Magdalen Islands, Monsieur Arsenault, to speak to that importance of the seal harvester, the seal harvest on the community in the Magdalen Islands.
OK, mais juste avant, puis peut-être, M. Arsenault, vous pourrez répondre à cette question-là, parce que...
Just before that, and we did have witnesses from the Île de Madeleine, but all the witnesses that came, other than the scientists from DFO, have said that there is a problem in terms of overpopulation of seals that has an impact on the ecosystems. And now we want to do more. We want that population to decrease so that it doesn't have an impact on other ecosystems. And we've always gone round and round. The excuse is that it might harm some markets, that we would make the seals disappear. So why are we going round in circles? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The issue of commercial hunting is a problem. What's the problem is that you can't develop a market for seals if that fisheries is not well controlled. So in order to do that, you have to participate with the industry to have the proper methods of capture and of slaughter, and also allowing us to go sell that meat on various markets. My final question, I don't know if there's a microphone that's open somewhere. My last question for you, the officials. Did you have discussions with the U.S. about certain ways of proceeding in order to have a more seal hunt that would allow us to reduce the population to happen, that wouldn't have an impact on the future ecosystem? Do you have these discussions with your colleagues in the U.S., and when is the last time that you discussed this topic?
So we are in constant contact with our U.S. counterparts on a number of fronts, including the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We are waiting for the comparability findings that should be coming out at the end of the year. I think on this front, we're constantly talking about marine mammals in the context of, for example, North Atlantic right whales and the impacts of unintentional entanglements with right whales in Canadian waters by Canadian fisheries. So, this is while we may not be talking specifically about, pinnipeds, I think that once we get the comparability findings at the end of this year, we'll continue discussions with them around marine mammals.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier. I want to say thank you to our witnesses for once again appearing before committee and answering questions and availing themselves to be here in person and by video conference. But that concludes this particular
Before you do conclude the meeting, Mr. Chair, I'd just like it clarified that the motion was
two
passed.
meetings.
Do we do two
yes,
meetings?
Yes, that's done. I said that when we were voting on it, that it's for 2 meetings, and everybody was fine with that. It's just composure of those 2 meetings.
Okay.
On Thursday, we will provide drafting instructions to the analysts for the report on pinnipeds, and we will discuss committee business, including potential committee travel during the July to December period. The deadline to submit travel budgets for this period is Friday, May 19th. To give the clerk and logistics officer sufficient time to prepare a budget, I would ask members who wish to put forth a travel proposal to come to Thursday's meeting prepared with details on the cities, regions to visit, the dates and duration of the trip and the format of the meetings we would hold. If anyone has any questions regarding this process, please contact the clerk. Mr. Morrissey?
Through you, could you clarify the questions that were asked, if the witness could provide them in writing to the answers in writing to the committee, because they didn't get a chance on a number?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, definitely. Hearing nothing else, Meeting adjourned.